What's up, folks? This conversation is going to be mostly audio. I don't think you necessarily need to watch the video, so you're probably better off just listening in the background. I'm going to have some footage here from my Super Mario 3D Land retrospective again. If you want to watch that, check it out on Nintendine Plus. Otherwise, feel free to just put a headphone in your ear and listen to this episode of Nintendine Talks. So a little bit of an observation, maybe even a joke in the gaming community, is that Nintendo kind of has like a sequel console curse, we'll call it. This observation has been made because when they went from the Wii to the Wii U, you saw like a huge drop off there. What was it? The Wii was around 100 million and the Wii U was around 10 million. And then likewise, you saw when you jumped from the DS to the Nintendo 3DS, they sold like half as many units basically, from 150 to around 75-ish. And technically, even if you date further back from the NES to the SNES to the Nintendo 64 and the GameCube, which each one was kind of like an evolution of the one prior to it, Nintendo has basically really struggled to jump from one console to the next and be just as successful in the follow-up. Whereas with PlayStation, for example, the jump from PlayStation 1 to PlayStation 2 saw an immense amount of success. PlayStation 3 was a drawback, but then the success from the PS3 to the PS4, and then even through the PS5. Let's say the PS5 doesn't necessarily reach the numbers of the PlayStation 4, but it's still kind of close enough where it's not as dramatic as a drop-off like we've seen in the sequel consoles for Nintendo, with Nintendo's success often relying on some kind of gimmick. There's a bit of an exception here when it comes to the handhelds, but not really as much. Like, there was a pretty sizable drop-off from the Game Boy Color and Game Boy to the Game Boy Advance. But I mean, if those numbers are combined and the Game Boy was starting from 1989 and the Game Boy Advance didn't come out from 2001, and then the Game Boy Advance was really on the market for 3 or 4 years until the DS took over, it shouldn't really be that much of a surprise to anybody that the Game Boy Advance sold slightly less than the Game Boy and Game Boy Color. But still, when they went from the Game Boy Advance to the DS, the numbers skyrocketed. It halved effectively with the 3DS. And by the end of the 3DS and the Wii U, which was, for the most part, between the two of them, considered a fairly unsuccessful time for Nintendo, even if you could argue that the 3DS is not really a failure, the vibes around Nintendo for the time was not at its highest, we'll say. Obviously, the two of those, with the combined forces of the handheld and the home console, you got the Switch, and that was revolutionary, and it sold as a revolutionary console should. And then now, with the launch of the Nintendo Switch 2, there's a bit of a cloud around whether or not this thing is going to succeed. Or perhaps I should reword it as, how much is this thing going to succeed? Because it kind of depends on what you define as success with the console. I think most people would agree that if it sold 50 millions, it's probably underperforming. Even the 75 million of the 3DS, you look back at it and you're like, okay, objectively 75 million is not a failure, but most people kind of like look at what happened before and what happened after, and they're like, the 3DS could have done significantly better. So it's a very open-ended discussion about what would be considered a success for the Nintendo Switch 2. So, for example, the Switch 2 just had the most abysmal holiday you can possibly imagine for a new game console on the market that's highest in demand in its first holiday season, right? But many people will cope and look at that and say that the economy's bad. Like, how well did you think this was going to sell? So there are a lot of people that are patting themselves on the back because they support Nintendo and they feel that Nintendo, despite all these hard times, has overperformed. But I would argue that since July, the Switch 2 has not been a success when it comes to consoles that are actually purchased by people. Nintendo has done a very good job shipping out the consoles to the places that it's wanted, but given that the majority of the sales generally come in the holiday season and that's when the failure happened, I think they clearly overshipped, and if it's not reflected in these upcoming financials, it'll be reflected in the following one. So the question right now is if Nintendo is able to get out of this rut that it's in. And I think for most people, the assumption is, yes, they very obviously can. But many of those same people were assuming that it was going to have one of the best holidays and first years that you've ever could possibly imagine after its launch, when in reality, pretty much worldwide, the sales have been slowing down since. So if this downward trend and downward momentum continues and it doesn't really have a killer holiday next year, things could be looking very uncomfortable for Nintendo. And it could very easily be the continuation of the sequel console curse. Now, to be clear, I think many people were feeling very bullish when it came to the launch of the Switch 2. They automatically assumed this thing was going to hit 150 plus million, 200 million in its lifetime, and it still might. There's a lot of years ahead of us right now. We don't know what Nintendo's game plan is. But I think most realistic expectations were that if this thing can reach 100 million in this gaming community with console sales supposedly slowing down and the gaming industry changing and hardware prices no longer going down because the companies are making enough off of subscription models where they don't need to get more customers in for software sales, then that 150 million number is not very realistic of a target. A lot of people have capped it off assuming that it can hit 100 million, whatever. It just seems like people are throwing numbers at a wall right now and seeing what sticks. Now, in my case, I said at the very start of this, prior to the launch of the console, that I think realistically, even if they change nothing, the Switch 2 should be able to hit 50 million, after the launch in those first 2 or 3 months, I kind of lowered that estimate to around 30 million. This, of course, was with the assumption that the Nintendo Switch 2 would have the same launch as every other console that came before it, like the PlayStation 5 and Series X and even the Switch back in the day, where it's not getting major discounts on a worldwide level within the first year or two. So naturally, since these price drops have already started in the first 6 months, I still think that it's going to be around 30 million, but that 30 million to 50 million is probably a very realistic range. Again, this is assuming there's no official price drop from Nintendo. And personally, I would say if that's what the Nintendo Switch 2 does, it's considered a failure. Right, like you have the Xbox Series consoles. I think it's pretty much unanimously agreed upon that those are failures right now. I don't think there's anybody who's looking at them and trying to claim that they're successes. And if you believe the reports and the estimates, the Xbox Series consoles have sold 3 times as much as the Wii U. So if Xbox can do that basically without any market in Japan, Nintendo, with these discounts that happen on holiday seasons, could easily reach that 30 to 50 million window. And I would consider it a failure personally. But the question is whether or not I would view it as more similar to a Wii U or a 3DS. And I think there are quite a few factors here to analyze when you consider it. And really, it's all contingent on whether you view this with the angle that it's a portable device or it's a home console. This is the whole hybrid situation. You can kind of pick and choose how you want to view the Nintendo console based off of what fits your narrative the best, I guess. The 3DS, sitting at 75 million, sold worse than the Game Boy, Game Boy Advance, and the DS. So if the Switch 2 sold fewer than 75 million units, it would be the worst selling handheld Nintendo console. But as long as it surpasses 50 million, the only home consoles that would have been higher than it would be the Wii and the Switch. So most people won't look back at the Switch 2 as like the worst Nintendo console, because you pretty much have everything from the NES until the GameCube that sold fewer units than that. But I think logically speaking, the Switch 2 has enough going for it where even if it outsold everything outside of the Wii and the Switch, it would still easily be considered, if not a failure, at least a dramatically underperforming console. And to understand that, you kind of have to look at why the 3DS was able to save its first year versus why the Wii U could not save its image. Because the fates of the 3DS and the Wii U can fall to a few different things, and some of those are in favor of the Switch 2 and others are not going to help it at all. And so first off, with the 3DS, having a major price drop from Nintendo early on in its life helped it big time. It was still fresh enough in the market where by the time they dropped the price, it was kind of able to still have a second launch. It entirely saved its first year. Not only did they drop the price to the point where it was much more affordable for the masses on a worldwide scale, but it was basically the cheapest, most affordable gift that you can buy somebody through every single holiday season for the next few years. It had a monopoly on the handheld market, and it had a monopoly on the budget console market. Something that we basically would have seen carried on to the Switch Lite, for example. In addition to all of that, if you were somebody that was looking for a handheld game console, your choices were basically the 3DS, which was much more affordable and getting a whole ton of Nintendo content that didn't feel like it was relegated handheld second-tier stuff. Or it was the PS Vita, which was much more expensive, sometimes more expensive than home consoles that were available. And for most people, it never felt that much like Sony was giving that much love to the PS Vita brand as it was to the PS4. And I think the fate of both of those devices kind of depend on how successful or unsuccessful their home consoles were. The PlayStation 4 was doing great. Sony was making a killing off of that. They didn't need to rely as much on their handheld, and Nintendo has always put a lot of attention, a lot of care into their handhelds, but they had to do it even more so because of how poorly the Wii U was doing. So naturally, all these things kind of tied together and made the 3DS even more successful. Now, on the opposite end of the spectrum, you have the Nintendo Wii U. They launched the price too high, right off the bat. In the States, the Wii came in at $250 and included Wii Sports. If you wanted the Wii U Deluxe Edition set that also bundled a game, you were paying 40% more. The problem was with the Wii U, they waited an entire year to drop the price, waiting until the following September after the console launched. So it was closer to like 10 months. And even then, when they dropped the price, they took it down $50 to $300, which was still more expensive than the Wii. And many people still felt it was too expensive because for not too much more, you could be getting a true next-gen experience with the PlayStation console, as well as the Xbox One, but that had to get a price drop as well. So basically, the Wii U launched in its November, its first year, it was too expensive, there wasn't really that much interest in it. You know, those final few years of the original Wii's life, it was like a slow, painful crawl. Nobody really felt that much excitement for the console anymore. It was nothing like the hype that we felt leading from the Switch to the Switch 2. It was more kind of like, we need to move on from the Wii because it's just not, it's not a thing. It's not as popular anymore. It was still kind of doing fine with the casuals. Many people were still playing Wii Sports to that day, and many people were buying more Wii's for the sake of playing Wii Sports, but not really much else, especially for the hardcore gamers. So the Wii U goes through an entire year. It's not really all that popular. It's too expensive. It shows up in the following year priced at $300, and it's going head-to-head with the launch of the PlayStation 4. Now, by that point in time, most of the buzz was around the PlayStation 4, and everybody was hyped for it, and many people had already written off Nintendo's Wii U. So any advantage the Wii U might have had for launching early basically went out the window. And any chance it had to come back from that downfall was made significantly harder to climb back from, because the PlayStation 4 just continued to look more and more appealing as time went on. And again, after the Xbox One had its price drop, it also had its giant audience coming in to buy it. The popularity of the PlayStation 4 took away a lot of that young demographic that might have purchased the Wii U. You know, beyond the 90s, if you're nostalgic for Nintendo right now, it's either because you started off with the Wii, or you're like almost in your 20s and you started off with the Switch. There will be a few people from the Wii U, and that's kind of what got them started, but I think for the most part, it's the console before and the console after. But I remember between the Wii and the Switch, most kids were not interested in the Nintendo console the way you would have expected it. A lot of them were just buying PlayStation 4s and they were playing Fortnite, Minecraft, or whatever other free-to-play game that their parents were able to let them get a hold of. And really, that was enough for most of these kids. Most families are not dropping money on two different game consoles that are this expensive. And if the PlayStation 4 is all the hype and all the kids are playing it in school, that's what they're buying. And it's part of the reason why the PlayStation will be as successful as it is. Now, obviously, in addition to that, you have all of the other markets for Sony. Like you have their hardcore dedicated fan base. You have the groups of people that love to play specific third-party titles, whether it's a shooter or a sports game, and they're buying the PlayStation 4 for that reason. But I'm specifically mentioning the kids because they're the ones that were kind of taken from the Nintendo market, right? Historically, that's kind of been Nintendo's forte. This made it very difficult for Nintendo to come out of this rut with the Wii U. And obviously there's a plethora of other issues, and many of them have been discussed in this channel and many other channels as well. But it was very hard for Nintendo to come out of this, even with an amazing Zelda title, an amazing Mario title, Mario Kart 8, which is, everybody's favorite Mario Kart. Until now, people swear by Twilight Princess HD and Wind Waker HD being on the Wii U being the best versions of those games. Smash Brothers, obviously, and then just think about every single good Nintendo Switch game. It's either a port of the games that came from the Wii U, or it's a direct sequel that's completely built off of the Wii U version, and it's almost the same game. So maybe not in the beginning of its life, but definitely by the end of its life, the Wii U had that. But it was not enough to overcome that terrible starting launch, whether it's because of the price or the lack of the software in its first year, or the fact that families are not going to drop an additional $300 on a console after they bought something for $400 in the PlayStation 4 or the Xbox. Especially when many of them just look back and are like, well, we already have a Wii at home. Why would we need a Wii U? Now, just a quick little random tidbit. The Wii U sold worldwide, I think it was 13.56 million. So the Switch 2 will have already surpassed it, at least with the shipped units. But even what's sold through to customers is probably only lagging by 1 or 2 million maximum, and it's probably going to overtake it very soon. But keep in mind, in the Americas specifically, 6.5 of the Wii U units were shipped there. So it's twice as much as everywhere else, and it has roughly half of all the Wii U units that have been sold. So if you're living in the States and it still kind of feels like not that many people have a Switch 2 because you remember more people having the Wii U, it's because it actually has not surpassed the Wii U yet in the States. Probably going to need another few months for that, maybe even upwards of a year, depending on how fast or slow the next few months go for the Switch 2. But yeah, basically the point is that the Wii U kind of lost its window of opportunity to capitalize on, and no matter how much they tried to solve it, no matter how great the games were in its later half of its life, it couldn't come back from the loss. And actually, if you want to dig deeper into it, part of that reason is because the Nintendo 3DS exists. So to an extent, this is actually a bit of a disadvantage for the Wii U. There are plenty of people out there that are absolutely more than fine just having the Nintendo handheld and not necessarily needing the home console. If you bought the 3DS, you got a 3D Mario, you got Smash Bros, you got Mario Kart. So you might be completely content with that and be like, the Wii U games look decent, but I have a version of these and I'm okay with just sticking with the 3DS, especially because once the media kicks off and everybody's talking about how the Wii U is failing, it's very hard to come out of that. So this kind of means that everybody's secondary console is still the Nintendo console, but it's not the home console, it's the handheld. So in the previous generation, you might have been like, I got the Xbox 360 and decided to get a DS with it. And then in the following generation, you'd be like, I don't know what Microsoft is doing with the Xbox One, but I'm definitely getting a PlayStation 4 instead. And I don't know what Nintendo is doing with the Wii U, I'm just going to grab a 3DS. And since people were more than content having their Mario and their Nintendo fill by grabbing a 3DS, for some of those people, because of how advanced the 3DS was by this point in time, in comparison to the DS compared to its counterparts in the console gaming world, the 3DS probably scratched that Nintendo itch that many people had, where they could much more easily ignore the home console. Now, this is actually an advantage for the Nintendo Switch 2. There were rumors of like leaks for the Switch 2 Lite, I think in the past couple of days. This is all like very clickbaity stuff. This doesn't lead anywhere. It's people getting their hopes up for nothing. Some people might have debunked it. Other people might say that it has ground. For me, anything Nintendo related, and I think I've kind of made this very clear, it's much easier to keep your hopes down and not trust any leaks and assume every single thing out there coming is fake until it's officially told by somebody extremely credible than it is to fall for all of this clickbaity hype that always jumps online. It's like the same story with what happened with the Mario Kart World DLC that people swore we were going to be getting by the end of last year. Just don't buy into it until there's something official. Likewise with like the 3D Mario situation. Everybody's like, well, don't you know that the team that worked on Odyssey was actually split off and that one did Bonanza, so that other person probably was working on 3D Mario? No. Maybe they were. It's possible it's right, but no, it's better to not assume these things. But yeah, backtracking a bit. My point is, when it comes to the Nintendo Switch 2, there is no alternative unless it's the Switch 1, which that will be enough for some people actually, but it's not to the same extent as like the 3DS. So if somebody bought a Switch 1 back in 2017, 2018, and they're like, I'm due for an upgrade. I want something new. I'm kind of done with this. They can't fall back to Nintendo's handheld because the handheld and the home consoles have been merged. So this is obviously a very huge advantage in favor of the Switch 2. But there are some disadvantages that are going against it as well. Part of the reason the 3DS was able to come out of what it did is because it was the budget option. The Switch 2 is not the budget option. I think the PlayStation 5 is still being sold for $400. But even if all of these sales end and PlayStation 5's cheapest model is $500 or more, or like right now the Steam Deck discontinued the LCD model, which used to be cheaper than the Switch 2, so now it's like the entry level for the Steam Deck is technically the Steam Deck OLED at $550. The prices of the competition going up does not mean that the Nintendo Switch 2 is a budget option. It means there are no budget options. So what happens now is when people are going to the stores and they're seeing that every single console is $450 to $600, they're going to buy their kids a tablet instead. They're going to buy them AirPods instead. I don't know, maybe people start giving their kids bikes and be like, go play outside. We're not doing video games anymore. It's way too expensive. As has been made very clear by many Nintendo fans, because they've finally come aboard to what we were saying back in April, life has become very expensive and our purchasing power has not increased with the expenses of life. This is why from the very beginning I said Nintendo was playing with fire by increasing their price as much as they did. And I think it's hilarious because as recently as 2 months ago, you'd see comments from Nintendo fans like this all over the internet. Since the Switch 2 is the fastest selling console ever by Nintendo's report, I'd say that's more a sign that the industry is healthy despite the economy than anything bad for Nintendo. Now, obviously, the beat of their drum has changed dramatically because the 5-year-old PlayStation 5, which is performing poorly, completely outsold it pretty much on a worldwide scale outside of Japan in every market and embarrassed the Switch 2 in its first holiday season where they were effectively similar in price through most markets, a little bit more of a gap in some of the places in Europe. And so now Nintendo fans are finally like blaming the economy, when in reality, not too long ago, they were saying the industry was very healthy. And I think the PlayStation 5 being 5 years old and still being as expensive as it is does show that the gaming industry still is somewhat healthy to an extent. And the Nintendo Switch 2's failures are more because Nintendo is dropping the ball here for a plethora of reasons that I've gone into in many videos. But my point is, with all of the game console prices going up and just refusing to have price drops now, having the cheapest game console, if it's still priced at a premium price, which is what the Switch 2 is priced at, is not enough to be considered the budget gift for people in the holiday season. And that's a huge reason as to why Nintendo consoles have always sold so well. That's the reason why the Switch sold so well. That's a reason why the 3DS was able to come out of its rut. And it's definitely something that's going to be going against the Nintendo Switch 2 going forward until there is a budget option, if there is ever a budget option for the Switch 2. It just kind of depends on how you define the word budget and how much that price is. Because up until a year ago, the budget option was $200 for a Switch Lite. So a $350 Switch 2 Lite may still not have that same impact that the other Nintendo handhelds did. So while the Nintendo Switch 2 will have a lot of advantages that the Wii U did not have, primarily that it's the only Nintendo console available, there's no handheld to take its place, there's no PlayStation 6 coming anytime soon, and while the PS5 is outselling it, if the PS5 was to drop their price in half right now, for example, the same way that the PS4 did back in 2017, you would see a vast majority of the gaming industry flock over to Sony at that point in time. So the competition is not quite there to completely put the dagger through the Switch 2 as it was with the Wii U, with the PlayStation 4 launching just a year later. Nintendo has a little bit more wiggle room here, but it's still not completely to the point where they can rest on their laurels. But this also means if they wanted to, they could put off doing a potential price drop. Again, this is assuming that the sales continue at the downwards trends that they've been on for the past few months, with a few spikes in holiday seasons or releases of big titles. The thing is, what Nintendo would not want to do is wait too long to drop that price if that was going to be the solution. Because this was another advantage for the 3DS. They dropped the price early enough where it was still able to catch that initial hype for the console launch. If Nintendo is shrugging and they're like, I don't care, we already shipped out 15 to 20 million units worldwide. Who cares if we have a slow couple of quarters because of the economy? And they get arrogant going into the following holiday season and they just don't really make the numbers that they expect to get at the start of 2027, it's a very good chance that if they drop the price then, it might be too late. Because families that otherwise would have bought in might have been like, yo, like the PlayStation 4 digital edition keeps dropping to $400 from Sony. We're just going to give you that, and that's going to be your gift. You're going to be a PlayStation child now. That's already happened this holiday season. That's a huge reason why Sony did so well. It's because it was $400, and when people went to the store, it was either that or the Nintendo Switch 2, which cost $450, and the Switch 2 games were all Switch 1 games. So there were plenty of people that effectively were like, screw it, I'm just going to buy my kids a PlayStation 5. Now, despite the entirety of this conversation, I would be extremely confident on the Switch 2 being an absolute failure, maybe slightly more successful than the Wii U, if it wasn't for one single X factor. We've seen consoles fail with a 3D Mario. We've seen them fail with a Zelda. We've seen them fail with Smash Brothers. But something that we have yet to see a Nintendo console fail with, and again, it kind of depends on how you define fail, is with a Pokemon game. And that's what many people keep falling back to. They're like, by the end of 2026, they swear, and once again, you're looking at leaks here, so maybe, but they swear as if it was confirmed by Game Freak itself that Gen 10 will be coming out and it's Switch 2 exclusive and it's all coming at the end of 2026. Again, due to the mega leaks, it's very likely, but things can change. They could easily decide to delay the game because they're like, we just want to wait for the user base to get a little bit larger. Or they could decide after Pokemon Legends ZA performing so well on the Switch 1 that they just would rather not take any chances and force people to buy a new console for the next Gen 10 and make it cross-gen, because you know it's not going to be a next-gen experience, even if it's Pokemon, so it's probably going to be able to run on the Switch 1 regardless. Or they could be like, we're going to wait for that Switch 2 Lite whenever it may come, and that might not come until the end of 2027, or the year after that. So they could just make Pokemon Legends ZA be the Pokemon title for the next year and a half or 2 years. But let's say hypothetically they do decide to release Gen 10 and it's a Switch 2 exclusive at the end of this year. I question how many units people think it's going to sell. Right, again, because it depends on how you're defining a successful console here. The best Pokemon games, when the Nintendo Switch was at its peak and had the highest amount of people that have adopted the console, is Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. And a non-insignificant portion of those people bought the game with the launch of the Switch 2 as well, because it fixed a lot of those issues. But based off of Nintendo's last financials, Scarlet and Violet sits at 27.61 million and Sword and Shield sits at 26.96 million. Now, it's very important to remember that the Scarlet and Violet game and Sword and Shield, the Pokemon titles that come with two versions, generally speaking, it's not that many people that are buying it. It's not 27 million people buying it, because there's a very significant portion of that that's buying both games. I don't know if there's necessarily any data on it exactly, because it's not half the people, right? It's not everybody buying two copies, but it's also not irrelevant. Legends Arceus sold 15 million. That was a single version game. But at the same time, Legends Arceus had came out a few months after the Diamond and Pearl, and it launched in the slow month of January. And by the time you got to the holidays, that was when Scarlet and Violet launched, so Legends and Arceus didn't really have the same opportunity to bloom as most Pokemon games would. So basically, I don't think Pokemon only moves like 15 million people worth of consoles. It's probably, I would guess, around 20 million. With a maximum ceiling, if there's like a proportional growth with the Switch to 30 million, let's say, probably that's the most units that Pokemon will sell by itself, which is a huge number. But you also have to remember that a very significant portion of the population that decided to buy the Switch 2 already are Pokemon fans. Whether they bought it way back at launch, they bought it in October, or they bought it during this holiday season. Pokemon Legends ZA is probably going to be the best-selling game on the Nintendo Switch 2 that's not bundled as much as Mario Kart. It'll still get a huge bump because of its bundle, but it won't get as big of a bump as Mario Kart because I think there are more consoles that were bundled with Mario Kart at launch than there are Pokemon Legends. So easily, let's say that sold through to customers, right now the Switch 2 is around 12 million people total, maybe even 13 million people total. I'm guessing at least a quarter of that are the Pokemon fans. Perhaps even more than that, depending on the attachment rate when the financials come around. So this would be very hard to estimate, obviously, because you can't really separate everything altogether. But what's the upper limit of a failing Nintendo console that only the most hardcore fans buy into? I'd say at minimum, you're looking at Wii U numbers, right? That 13 million. That maximum, it's probably not any higher than 20 or 25 million. I don't know if it could reach the Xbox Series numbers because that was pretty much inflated because of a pandemic, right? So if you're looking at between 20 and 25 million, and then let's say Pokemon at best adds another 30 million to that, and you assume there's like a little bit of overlap between those fan bases, because most people that are buying a Nintendo console are probably interested in Pokemon. Even if it has a healthy life and it continues on, Pokemon's not going to make it sell 100 million. It's going to take more than that. Right, like the 3DS with the Pokemon being the only console available with Pokemon only reached 75 million. That was only a decade ago. Pokemon has grown in that time, but the growth of the franchise doesn't always directly translate to sales numbers, right? Pokemon Red and Blue and Green, I think, were still the best-selling games. And meanwhile, Gold and Silver, Diamond and Pearl, those are right behind the Switch titles. So just having Pokemon alone is not why the 3DS managed to get to 75 million. It's all of those other things that we talked about in this video. The lower price, the budget option, the fact that the Nintendo home console was kind of failing, they had nothing else to play. So this is a very big reason why even from the start, you couldn't really view the Switch 2 that it was going to be a Wii U in the literal sense. And all this, I'm not even talking about the fact that the Switch 2 is launching in a much more Nintendo-friendly atmosphere where people are more excited for this Nintendo console than pretty much any other console launch in history. But at the same time, I do view this as a potential 3DS situation. But even then, due to the nature of the high price tag, I don't know that it can reach 3DS numbers per se. It's just the reality that this is a hybrid console, so it's kind of a mixture between the two of them. Now, by the way, I still think the Nintendo Switch 2 can completely shake all of this off, and it's going to largely depend on that budget angle of things and how aggressive they want to be while putting out the budget console. Again, even a Switch 2 Lite at $300 or $350 is not really the budget gift option because there are more competitions out there that are not game consoles. But assuming they don't look at it from that angle, the 3DS, I mean, it had Pokemon games. It was very popular in Japan. Similar to the Nintendo Switch 2, it has roughly 1/3 of the entirety of the population that wants it, and it's even more in demand over there right now with the stock limitations. So the Switch 2 could actually outperform the US in Japan. But despite all of that, 3DS capped off at 75 million. And I think there were more advantages that the 3DS had, specifically with the price, that I do not think that the Nintendo Switch 2 is going to be able to overcome. Not with those prices and not in this economy. Also, keep in mind, these numbers of games sold, like these are lifetime sales numbers. It takes time to build up to these things. Even if a 3D Mario game comes out or a Pokemon game comes out, that doesn't mean that it's immediately going to sell 20 million consoles for 20 million people. There's a gradual increase over time. So things are always subject to change and always subject to evolve as time goes on. But I would say given the command that we saw in the console's launch, how quickly the demand fell from like a scalper angle, from the stock sitting on the shelves angle, and it was still its first year. And we saw that translate to discounts all around the world, followed immediately by embarrassingly low holiday sales. I think it's pretty clear that Nintendo is going to have to do something special to get out of this. And I don't think it's just going to be the games that are available, and I don't think it's only going to be about the prices. It's got to be a combination of both. And depending on how they deliver on both of those fronts, and how long they wait for both of those fronts, how long they wait for a price drop if that's coming, and how long they wait to start bringing out good games because they're really drip feeding and stretching all of this out, depending on how long they take to act upon this stuff, will make the Switch 2's success much less likely. But of course, like I've been saying, that's all going to largely depend on how you define a success or a failure. Anyway, I think that's enough for tonight. Thank you so much for listening, and I will catch you on the next one.